because I just had to move my presentation from Mac to Windows during the last speech very, very quickly, so I may have missed out a few points which are just still not working. Right? Okay, it is. Just Iran at a glance for those of you who would be interested in knowing. So we have GDP numbers. These are per capita nominal. On PPP basis is quite a bit higher. So on the PPP basis, this is about $1.2 trillion globally, basically number 18 or 19. Healthy government finances, but still hasn't stopped some budget issues and the currency crisis that you may have heard about. It's a very urbanized country, which I'll come to later, because this is an item that affects our industry. Basically, urban centers drive consumption. And some key numbers, basically. Overall, the largest hydrocarbon reserves in the world. The number 1 in gas and number 4 in oil. In terms of metals and mining resources, it's quite extensive, valued at about $30 trillion. I'll come to that a bit later. Globally, in the top 10 manufacturers of petrochemical products, and this is a sector still growing. And would be as a cable manufacturer, is a sector of interest because it's still driving some demand. The largest automotive market in the Middle East and the largest manufacturer. Currently at about 1.2 million units. I'll again elaborate on this because I think this is a potential growth sector and something that could be interesting for cable manufacturers to get into the wire harness business. The data and IT sector is rapidly growing. Very high penetration of smartphones and rapid expansion of the country's data infrastructure. I'm not in the fiber business or the data cable business yet, but again, an interesting sector. There's a project with 30 million fiber to home ports planned. And basically, what this is stuff I've taken out of a McKinsey report on Iran. Basically, McKinsey did a study on Iran saying, basically, if certain issues are resolved, we could have another $1 trillion in nominal GDP. So basically, tripling the nominal GDP by 2035. But this is going to need heavy investment, and there's a lot of challenges. The main issue actually has been macroeconomic stability. So most of the Iranian governments of the past 4 decades, they've printed money. They haven't been, I would say, budgetary sensible. Their budgetary discipline has been quite lacking. And they've printed money to meet the deficit. And the result of printing money has been inflation. They've tried to suppress the interest rate to fight inflation using oil income. But that's always just led to the spring being loaded, and then what we get sudden movements in the exchange rate when you fight the market forces, which has again happened in the last couple of months. So we've again devalued by another 40–50% in the last quarter. Not all of it is economical, a lot of it is also political. The market is responding to what Trump may potentially do. And also the financial system. The weakest point of the Iranian economy has been the financial system. And a real challenge to anyone who wants to do business in Iran. In the World Economic Forum competitiveness analysis also, this is where Iran scores the weakest in the development of the financial markets. Again, these are the challenges that have to be met. But the strengths, basically the economy is highly diversified. Education levels are very high, developed and basically sophisticated consumer class, and very entrepreneurial. So in terms, this is basically, and again, an expansion of the previous slide, where McKinsey thinks the growth will come. Oil and gas, as with most Middle Eastern countries, Iran has been underproducing relative to its reserves. So for example, in 1978, just before the revolution, we were exporting 5 million barrels a day. Right now, total production is about 3.5, out of which about 2.2 is exported. The rest is consumed locally. And again, that's another challenge. Fuel subsidies, energy subsidies in general, not just on fuel, also on electricity, have led to overconsumption. Basically, Iranians per capita consume about twice as much energy as the Turks do. And this has been a result of basically government subsidies in this sector, and it's costing the government quite heavily. Retail sector is rapidly growing. We've had about $80 billion of investment into building shopping malls in the past 4 or 5 years alone. Online retail has been expanding. The company I'm involved with is Iran's first unicorn. 5 years ago when I joined the board, there was 30 people. Right now it's 3,000 people. Transport, I'll elaborate on this again, but I think transport, especially railway infrastructure, it will drive some cable demand. Agriculture, this will have to be completely, really, I would say, moved, because right now it's traditional agriculture and is using a lot of water. Iran traditionally depends on snow melt because we have very, very few large permanent rivers. So we have a country where we have very high mountains, and we've dependent on snow melt, basically snow deposits and glaciers melting for water supply. And basically the old agricultural practices have meant that there's a lot of pressure on the water supply in the country. Real estate, with a young population, we've got 700,000 or 800,000 Iranians leaving university every year and entering the job market and obviously looking to form families. So they need housing. There was a government-sponsored housing project under the previous government of Ahmadinejad, but that was an absolute disaster. They sort of sunk about $200 billion into this, but they've built government housing that no one wants to live in. Location. Again, this is one of the potential drivers of growth. We've all heard about the Belt and the Road project, the Chinese project, but there's also that project is going mostly through Pakistan. There is now basically a joint economic project with India to develop the Chabahar port here. This is potentially one of the largest deep water ports in the region. And the location is just off Kheshmand at this corner of Iran. It could be used to transit goods into Central Asia. Again, on a natural air and road transport route into Europe and other Central Asian countries, and also for oil and gas pipelines. Basically, if the political problems are solved, Iran could potentially be an alternative source of gas for Europe. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why Russia is involved in Iranian politics to a certain extent to stop the alternative. I mentioned the metal and basic mining potential. You see, there's for example, globally for zinc, we're number 5. Copper, about 6% of world reserves. And again, this aluminum is produced locally. A lot of steel, the largest steel manufacturer in the region, and plans to actually quadruple steel production in the next 15 years. Again, something that in the last 2 years, despite the relatively low government investment in infrastructure, we've seen as a cable manufacturer that's been driving demand. We've been getting a lot of projects for our new aluminum smelters, for steel plants, and mine projects. I mentioned petrochemicals, and the reason this is a growth area. Major cost advantage for petrochemicals in Iran with the low price of gas feedstock and ethylene. Just the number to throw out there, but the average return in petrochemicals in Iran in the past decade has been 75% of equity every year. So it makes sense to invest, and a lot of private sector players are entering this. And oil. You see, we have one of the lowest production costs for oil in the world. So even at these current low depressed prices, it still makes sense and it still is profitable to produce oil. Again, cheap energy and raw materials. This has been another major driver of cable demand, cement plants. Actually, our company was in the fortunate position to be supplying most of the cables to all the plants built in Iran over the past 5 or 6 years. But this sector has been hit a couple of roadblocks lately, the downturn in the housing sector, and also issues with exports into Iraq that were driving demand until. I did mention the urbanization. So you got a country that's urbanized as the most developed countries in the world. And again, this has happened very rapidly, and the infrastructure in a lot of the cities has failed to catch up. So for example, Tehran, which is a city of 8 or 9 million, Tehran proper and greater Tehran, you're talking about 15 million people. And most of the transmission network is still 66 kV with some 220 kV. And this will have to be revised. And the same goes with a lot of the smaller cities. They're either on 66 kV or in some cases on 20 kV networks, and this all has to be revised. For example, in Tehran alone, we estimate immediate demand for about 2,000 kilometers of 66 kV cable. But there are budget issues. I did mention the consumer class in Iran. So despite the relatively low overall per capita income, there's a high percentage of households with reasonable disposable income. So you talk about basically globally, consumers are created when you have households earning $20,000 or more, and in Iran we have a lot of those. And these are basically the consumers who've been driving the upturn in the retail sector. Another major change in the consumer market in Iran has been the move from traditional unorganized retail to organized large-scale shopping malls and chain stores. And we've seen that that's happening very rapidly. One of the big UAE groups, for example, Majid Al Futtaim, has done really, really well out of this in Iran. Education level. So we've got about 800,000 students leaving university every year. Not always of good quality, but the good quality universities are good. About a quarter of these are in engineering and sciences. So about a country that's a third or a quarter of the population of the US is turning out almost as many engineers. That's meant a ready-made supply of good quality labor, but they have to be trained. On-the-job training is weak, and most Iranian companies have been mom-and-pop operations, small-scale operations with no proper human resource departments to develop the talent. And this is where actually the big international players who moved into Iran have done really well. So we've seen, for example, some major players, especially in the consumer goods sector, even in petrochemicals or in telecom, like MTN. Once they moved into Iran where they developed processes and know-how, and they could actually develop Iranian talent, they've managed to really move ahead of the local competition and do really well for themselves. Automotive, this is a sector that's attracted major foreign investment. Right now, we've got Renault investing in Iran in a new plant just south of Tehran. Volkswagen entered into a JV with an Iranian private sector company with a small government involvement. Same with the PSA group. Fiat's been looking at a few takeover or greenfield options. Hyundai has entered into a JV production agreement, and the Chinese manufacturers are also looking at the market seriously. Basically, it's projected that Iran will be exporting 350,000 units by the end of next decade. And all these new joint foreign investment projects have been signed on the basis that they will be foreign currency neutral. So for any component imported into the country, the investors or the European manufacturers have agreed to export either full manufactured autos or components out of Iran. And I really do believe that the wire harness business in Iran will expand rapidly. Currently, the copper consumption for wire harnesses is about 8,000 to 9,000 tons a year. But up until now, we were making very outdated cars with limited electrical systems. That's changing very rapidly. All these new plants coming online will be making latest generation automobiles, which obviously have much higher cable content in them. You're looking at some basically mobile penetration numbers. This is still a rapidly expanding sector. In the news in the past 2 or 3 weeks have been this fight between Russia and the company called Telegram. The fights also in Iran is interesting that Telegram, for example, has 200 million active users, 1/5 of which is in Iran. And social media like Telegram or Instagram have become a very, very active marketing and publicity tool for a lot of Iranian companies, even companies who are not involved with consumer goods. New economy. Basically, this is the company I'm involved with, right at the top there. But all these companies have now attracted European investment, some of them quite major. And in the absence of the international players, they've managed to dominate the local market. DigiColor, for example, the company I'm involved with, has a 92% market share of online retail in Iran. This is compared, for example, Amazon's share in the UK, which is about 18%. And the main sectors that have been attracting foreign investment. So power plants, we've seen a number of agreements signed. The challenge in the power sector has been getting paid because the traditional electricity has been heavily subsidized, so that's meant the Ministry of Energy has always had budget issues. But most of the new projects have a guarantee that they can export power, which, considering that cheap gas in Iran, can be very attractive. Petrochemicals, I already mentioned. Iron ore and steel production, the hotel sector, This is an area where the country is actually in heavy need of investment. Post-revolution and the nationalization of the major international hotel chains in Iran, very little investment was done. And for example, last week when we had the Tehran oil show, nobody could find hotel rooms in Tehran. I heard stories of people having to go about 100 kilometers out to satellite cities to be able to get hotel rooms. Iran is a big country with about 2 hours time difference from east to west, and a big temperature difference from north to south. So in the north of Iran, you've got very cool temperatures right now, probably about 20 degrees centigrade. And the northern neighbors of Iran have a very different power demand profile to the southern parts. In the north, it's mostly heating and cooking. Iran, not inside Iran, the neighboring countries. Iran, because of the division of energy sector within the Ministry of Petroleum, that's been basically sells the gas to the consumers, and the Ministry of Energy, which is water and power, has meant that every single village in Iran, above 10 households, has access to piped gas and also network electricity, which is a bit silly, which has also led to a situation where in the summer, we have peak demand of around 60 gigawatts, but in the winter this drops to about half, which means that there's a lot of unused resources. And there's discussions, for example, that in Tehran they might actually stop the supply of gas to Tehran and move everyone to electricity for both cooking and heating. Also, especially considering that Tehran is in an earthquake-prone zone, and that gas could be an issue should we have a big earthquake. So because of this profile, the time difference and temperature difference, Iran and the large installed base of about 80 gigawatts, which is the biggest in the region, Iran could basically act as a power arbitrage center for the entire region between different seasons and different times. Again, should the political situation allow this. Right now, there's discussions for a submarine link between Iran and Oman through Qeshm Island. So basically the idea is because there's a large gas field under Qeshm Island, to tap into the gas, build power cogeneration plants on Qeshm Island, and transmit the power to Oman. Similar talks with Kuwait. And the other thing that will change in Iran, so far they've been building the power plants next to the major population centers. With the water issue, I think we will have to move everything to the sea, either the north or the south. Look at cogeneration for the first time. So Iran doesn't do any desalination on a major scale. It's very small plants. And then perhaps a DC line linking the southern power plants to the major population centers in the north. Because in Iran, if you draw a line from northeast Iran to southwest, 75% of population and GDP is on the northern side. The southern side is relatively underdeveloped and underpopulated. And the cable sector. This is the actual challenge in the power sector. I did mention subsidized prices. High network losses. This could be a potential basically driver for demand. The high network losses stem from low voltage levels, which I mentioned have to be revised. Also, we still have, for example, bare overhead lines in a lot of the distribution network, and especially in the smaller cities and villages. The replacement of these lines is driving demand for ABC, aerial bunch conductors. But we've also got the issue that there's a lot of small-scale producers selling substandard cables to do these smaller projects. Right now, the price of ABC cables I've seen in most of these markets has been below raw materials cost. We've exited that market, actually, because we can't get into that game. There's an issue of power quality, again, because of the budget issues of the Ministry of Energy. I did mention water shortages and also the increased urban demand, which will, at some point, the entire net. The cable industry, so we've got about 200 registered companies. I mentioned this in the last conference. This is a hangover from the days of subsidized copper. At some point, we were getting copper at about 1/10 of LME prices. So this basically ended up in a situation when everyone was trying to register a cable company just to get a copper allocation from the government. This no longer exists. What's happening right now, we've pushed, as part of my hat with the Chamber of Commerce, we've pushed through a legislative bill through the Iranian parliament because so far all exports out of Iran are tax-free, whether it's finished products or raw materials. We've got a new bill in the parliament where there will be a tax applicable to the export of raw materials, and the refund of VAT will be dependent on value added, very similar to the Chinese system. So this, I think the end result of this legislative process will be that the price of raw materials in Iran will stabilize at around 2 to 3% below international prices. Pricing pressures. I mentioned substandard cables, but there's also right now, because of the downturn in the market, because of the government budget issues, and also the political situation that's held back major investment in oil and gas, there's a lot of pricing pressure. Really competition for projects down to break-even point. And cash flow issues, because a lot of clients, especially the contractors, EPC contractors, are paying late. Consolidation, we've been talking about this for a while. A major player, for example, went out of business a couple of months back, Simco, which was a joint venture with Ericsson, one of the oldest players. They went bankrupt with debts of about $25 million. But Iranian bankruptcy laws make it very difficult to take over a competitor and write down debts. So, I mean, I looked at this company very closely. I decided it didn't make sense. We walked away. The other basically change that I think is happening, especially in high voltage, 66 kV and above, is a move from supply only to EPC and EPCF models. This is happening at a very, I would say, a much faster pace. And I think within 2 or 3 years, we will have a situation where 80 or 90% of the projects in the high voltage sector will be on EPC basis. And again, as a cable manufacturer, I think it's important that we avoid this situation like in India, where it's only the contractors who are making any money. And it's important to basically to occupy that space before the contractors move into it. Opportunities. You mentioned that, for example, Saudi is consuming cables above its GDP or population levels. Iran is below. So the total market size right now, difficult to estimate. We still have a large part of the economy which is non-transparent, doesn't pay taxes or issue invoices. But I estimate the total cable market to be between 1 and 1.2 billion euros a year, out of which about 30 million is being imported, negligible imports, and exports of about 100 to 150 million euro a year. I would say an average, a 5-year average of around 130 or 40. Again, below potential. If you consider a country like Turkey is exporting $2 billion without a single copper mine, Iran should be doing a lot more. Automotive, mining, and railways. For example, right now I've got 2 clients with confirmed orders for 1,000 railway cars. That's a considerable amount of cables that will go into these. And wire harnesses, the mining sector. Again, the mining sector has been less affected by the government budget issues because it's an export-oriented sector and it's dominated by private players. And we have much more stringent localization laws. Because of the large number of people entering the jobs market, unemployment has become a major issue, and it was one of the drivers behind the unrest we had in January. Youth unemployment was one of the key issues, and the government's realized that. For example, in the railway sector, they've just increased the localization threshold from 25% to 58%. And oil and gas is 51% minimum, in the electrical sector is 70%. And that's why